This is Moderate Rebels. I'm Ben Norton. We have a guest back with us who is a superstar in Mexican politics and is all over the media right now. I'm talking about John Ackerman. John is a professor at the Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, and he's a major ally of the left-wing president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who's known by the acronym AMLO, AMLO. So we'll switch between calling him AMLO and López Obrador in this interview. You all, the hardcore listeners and viewers might remember that Max interviewed John back in Mexico after the inauguration of López Obrador. This was a historic inauguration. AMLO is the first left-wing president in Mexico in really about 40 years. And he is a progressive who has launched a kind of revolutionary movement he calls the Fourth Transformation and has been trying to fight systemic corruption. He's also pledged to combat neoliberalism. And John Ackerman has been a major supporter of AMLO and has a lot of enemies on the Mexican right wing. So today we're gonna kind of start off talking about what AMLO has been doing and what the Fourth Transformation is. And then later on, we'll get into some deeper details here and the kind of scandalous part, maybe the more fun part. We're going to talk about who some of the far-right forces are trying to destabilize the AMLO government, including some very weird fringe characters like Gilberto Lozano and some others. So we'll talk about that later on. And then we're also going to talk about just what the media situation is, because there have been so many media attacks, not just on López Obrador, but specifically on John recently. So with that, John, we'll cut to you. Thanks for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you. And can you just, the last time we had you, it was right at the beginning of the AMLO administration. There was so much excitement. And what has happened in the past 2 years?
It's been intense. It's actually only been 1 year. It feels like it's been an eternity. Great to be on the show again, Ben, Max. A real honor. I follow you consistently, and you're a real reference for international reporting on the truth. It's just terrible. I mean, the media is horrible in Mexico, but it's getting worse, I think, in the world, and places like your outlet are a real message, I hope. So it's a real privilege and honor to be with you guys.
Thank you. And our country's clearly doing our best to export its media system south of the border. So
exactly, but the fight continues on, and truth will prevail. So it was about a year and a half ago, I guess. Last time we talked, you guys came down here in Mexico City to share in the excitement. Things have been very intense. So López Obrador really hit the ground running. He's been really transforming the way in which the government works. Right. I published an article just last year in a volume edited by Steve Elner about all different countries in Latin America. I got the opportunity to write the Mexican piece, and we examined different perspectives. I mean, there's a radical critique of López Obrador, right? He hasn't come in to expropriate the airwaves or take away all the private contracts that were given to international oil companies under the neoliberal regime. He hasn't done sort of really aggressive socialist acts, but what he's been doing has been really kind of the equivalent. That's what I write in this piece, which is recovering the state, the government, for the public interest. So just recently, one of the most recent announcements is that he has convinced Coca-Cola, Walmart, and IBM to return to pay millions of dollars in back taxes, which had been pardoned over the last 10 years, and force them to, for the future years, to actually pay the taxes that are on the books. This sounds like basic rule of law stuff, but this is actually world-shaking stuff, because these major corporations were the ones who called the shots and determined and controlled the government for the last 30 years, if not more. And this money is being brought in, and also the government, which had been, ironically, under the neoliberal government, supposedly are in favor of low spending theoretically, but in fact, what the neoliberal governments did was to inflate spending, but not spending for social programs or hospitals or highways, but spending on corruption, on buying votes, on buying expensive houses for politicians, and on just sort of creating new jobs and responsibilities from the government for their friends and their family. And so another thing that Lopez Obrador has done is just cut out all of that waste, that corrupt waste, and with those savings and with the new tax revenues, has created massive new social development programs. So now all high school students and junior high school students in the public school systems have scholarships for their books, for their transportation, for their basic expenses. All elderly over 60 or over 65, depending on which part of the country, now have state pensions. He has rebuilt. There are over 100 hospitals which were supposedly inaugurated during the neoliberal regime, but that they had these big ceremonies with the beds and the computers and the doctors there, and then the next day they took all those beds and moved them to the next hospital to inaugurate the next one. So they were just sort of literally white elephants who are now actually being put back into service. He's creating a whole network of 100 new universities throughout the country, particularly in the most abandoned, poor areas of the country, in Chiapas and Oaxaca and Guerrero and Michoacan. He's constructing a network of 100 new universities. He's conducted a new legal reform, labor reform, which was in some ways caused by this renegotiation of NAFTA turning into USMC, but it was coming in under on its way anyway due to the Morena platform. That Morena is Lopez Obrador's party, and now for the first time they're going to be free and fair union elections. The unions in Mexico have been strong historically, but also very corrupt and controlled by government, particularly by this fact that the elections were not free and fair. And now the future elections are going to have to be in private and protected ballot boxes with independent committees who actually count the votes. We have a new constitutional reform which requires a gender parity in all levels of government and for all collective bodies. So all cabinets from now on, Lopez Obrador's cabinet itself is half women, half men. But in the future cabinets for the state level, the municipal level governments, the Supreme Court, the electoral authorities, they're all going to have to be totally half. We already have in the Congress, half of Congress, both the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate, is men and women, way ahead of the United States. I think only Cuba and one African country, I think it's Nigeria, has more women in their Congress than Mexico. There's a major development going on in the south of Mexico. The south of Mexico is the poorest area of Mexico. We have a real regional divide. There are new development programs going on there, and support for, in general, the countryside, for the peasants, price supports, fertilizers. The whole idea in terms of combating crime in general is to get to the roots, right? To use these social programs to support the youth, support the countryside, so that they don't need to enroll in the forces of these narco trafficking. And that's another big issue in terms of violence. Violence continues to be at a very high level. It's basically the same as it was under Peña Nieto, but the strategy is radically different, and we are hoping that by the end of his 6-year term, this will actually make a significant difference. He's created a whole new national institution called the National Guard. It's different from the National Guard in the United States, but it's a civilian-run institution which is using the military in the short run, but will turn into a totally civilian institution over the next few years. And he's recruiting lots of new youth with new training in human rights and citizen protection to create an entirely new body, which we hope will not be corrupt. That's the big problem, in terms of violence, is that the police themselves have been corrupt. And so he's creating a whole new body which is independent from corruption. And the combating corruption in general has been his number one plank, ending this corrupt low level and high level. But I'm probably talking too much. Why don't you guys interrogate me?
Oh, that was a great overview.
Since you brought up so many achievements, I wanted to ask about the Trump AMLO meeting, but first, just on the on this topic, there's been a lot of, or a decent amount of reporting in U.S. media about the problems that Pemex, the Mexican state oil company, is facing, and Pemex was what AMLO said that he hoped would become the engine of all these social programs, which you were ticking off. And my question, I guess, is, we have the pandemic, the crash in oil prices, which have clearly hurt Pemex, and Moody's has downgraded their rating, which will make it harder for them to borrow. So what are the prospects for this economic model that cuts against the privatization model that previous Mexican presidents have relied on?
Yeah, it was fascinating. Last year, when López Obrador announced his plans for Pemex, and his plans are injecting new resources, new investments into Pemex, creating a new refinery. Mexico hasn't created a new refinery for decades, 30 years since they've created a new refinery. They built a new refinery. The next day, I don't know if it was Moody's or some other international grading agency, immediately downgraded Pemex. Right? This was very ironic, of course, because the day in which the government is announcing its major support for the company is the day in which the international markets go sour on Pemex. Why is this? Well, they're totally related, because precisely as international graders are not interested in actually the health of Pemex. What they're interested is in investment opportunities for international corporations. And so if the Mexican government is investing in Pemex, that means that Pemex is going to be less desperate in need of these lines of credit and support from these international corporations. And that it means that there's somehow a less good investment climate. I mean, it's just so incredibly perverse.
Very reminiscent of the 2002 oil conflict in Venezuela.
Sure, of course.
Over PDVSA.
Mm-hmm. Of course. And so that's been a real struggle, but it's happening. The Mexican government is reinvesting in Pemex, and they're building this refinery even in the middle of the COVID crisis. López Obrador has gone and visited the refinery. The refinery is on I think it's a year and a half. It should be inaugurated. It's a big thing, right? They're also renovating the local refineries, and the opposition in Mexico, they make fun of López Obrador. They say this is old energy. We need to look at new renewable energies, which is of course important to look at renewable energies. But the idea that oil is not a business anymore, is not a good investment, is absolutely absurd. I mean, tell that to Shell or Exxon. I mean, these guys are still doing pretty well.
It's amazing. Sorry to cut you off there, John, and I want you to continue that thought. But this raises a point that I want to talk about later. It also is an example of how the right wing is trying to weaponize what seem as progressive talking points in order to attack AMLO. And this is also related to the issue of women's rights, which we'll get into later. But I remember López Obrador gave a speech in which he joked that his conservative opponents overnight had become feminists. And similarly, his conservative opponents overnight have become environmentalists.
Right, exactly. We can go directly to that point in terms of environmental stuff. Just one point before that, in terms of the international presence of Mexico in the oil markets, but with one of the great victories, this was in the beginning of April. Rocío Nale, our energy minister, was invited to the OPEC Plus meetings, which is OPEC Plus, other major producers. The United States doesn't participate directly, but Russia was there and others. There was an initial agreement for across the board cut of, I think, 30%. And Mexico said, well, we're with you, we participate with you, but we're not going to take the 30% cut because because of the neoliberal de-investment of the last years, we're already way below where we should be. And so we're only going to cut 10%. I think the difference was between 400,000 and 100,000 barrels a day. And the international oil press all of a sudden got crazy, right? For during 3 days, it was, Mexico is ruining the international deal based on their backwards, defense of their sovereignty and this new president who thinks he can, order around the world, right? Well, a few days went by, and this was on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and on Sunday, everyone agreed. Okay, we'll give you a chance, Mexico. We understand your situation. Next time we'll have another round of talks, but for now, we'd rather have you on board than to kick you off because of your need to not reduce the cuts as much as everyone else. And it was an amazing success because those 300,000 barrels a day that we saved by defending our sovereignty without breaking with the international agreement means more social programs, more schools, more highways for the Mexican people. And the opposition in Mexico was totally taken aback by that because they were thinking this was going to be a major failure for Mexico, similar to the Trump López Obrador meeting. We can get to that, but just to go to the environmental stuff. Also, about a month ago, the Mexican Secretary of Energy issued new rules, new rules which are like 3 pages long, which basically tell the major international corporations who are doing green environmental investments that they need to pay their fair share. Right? Because hidden behind the environmental agenda in the previous government, Peña Nieto had basically committed the Mexican government to paying for incredible amount of costs for these environmental for instance, wind farms and we could take the wind farm case particularly. When there's no wind or solar, you guys know, the central energy grid has to take over, right? And so this creates transaction costs, right? When the renewable energies stop, the normal energies have to kick in at higher levels and then go out once the renewables come in. And this costs a lot in terms of it's not just sort of like a switch you turn off and on in your house. You need to reserve it to kick in at that moment, and it's a complex technical thing that I don't understand all the details, but it's an expensive process which the Mexican government had committed to doing so, which meant incredible subsidies to Iberdrola, to Northland Energy of Canada, I think, to Sempra in the United States, which might be investing in renewable energies, but are not exactly damas de la caridad, we say, Mother Teresa, right? They're not here to help Mexico. They're looking for investments. And so when the Mexican government, with the new Mexican government, changed the rules in order for there to be a more fair take, equivalent to other levels in the government, what the opinion to giveaway had been was much larger than any support for renewable energies which exists in the world, in Germany or anywhere. Just coming back to international standards, there was an incredible outcry. Even the British embassy in the U.S., the EU representation in Mexico issued these sort of diplomatic notes saying that Mexico was, as if Mexico had been was expropriating their investments, and everything, of course, was presented as a question of environmentalism and environmental protection. And of course, López Obrador is not against environmental development, but he is very much aware that this is often a masquerade for transnational corporations, leeching the Mexican state resources, which are very much needed for attending to poverty and development.
So what you're describing is transnational corporations seeking to undermine this government. These are transnational corporations that we would generally associate with Washington. And AMLO has just been in Washington. He had what appeared to be a very friendly meeting with Donald Trump, and he faced a lot of criticism for it because of Donald Trump's general attitude towards Mexicans and Mexican Americans. I mean, we know from 2016, Donald Trump spent like an hour in this nationally televised rally talking about how Mexicans are rapists, bad hombres. The CEO of Goya Foods, which produces food throughout Latin America, he got skewered on social media today for meeting with Trump. Trump's pretty toxic if you are in any way associated with Latin America or Latinos, for good reason. But AMLO also seemed to be kind of trying to offset the pressure from Washington. But there was another episode I wanted to mention, which I guess policy I wanted to mention, which was Lopez Obrador agreeing to sort of police the U.S.-Mexico border on the southern side under clear pressure from Donald Trump, which drew a lot of criticism. A lot of my leftist Mexican friends were like, what is he doing? I want to get your general thoughts on the meeting with Trump, but what's behind this? What's the what kind of three-dimensional chess is AMLO playing here?
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. We'll get to that point that Ben mentioned in the beginning, but it's directly related. Lopez Obrador is under serious pressure from these transnational corporations and local, specific group of local oligarchs and just sort of crazy right-wing people who are committed with the possibility, or obsessed with the idea of organizing some sort of coup or kicking out Lopez Obrador. From day one, they've been calling for Lopez Obrador's head, for his resignation, organizing marches, and the media in particular has been incredibly aggressive.
Yeah, and really quickly, one of those groups, which we'll talk about later, has been calling for him to be kicked out or to resign as soon as November. So they're not even saying in a few years, they're saying immediately.
Right, exactly. Because the Mexican Constitution says that if you don't make it to the first 2 years, then there's a new election. But once you've gotten past the first 2 years, then there's more of an institutional replacement process that the sitting government will be able to control, and they want him out, right? And you mentioned the role of the media. Yes, so the media is 80-90% anti-AMLO. The same guys who were, who used to applaud everything or anything that Peña Nieto, the previous president, used to say, are now attacking every possible detail, from, his Lopez Obrador's shoes to his accent to the way in which he walks or travels or does, right? And so he's under a serious pressure. There's important columnists, I wouldn't say well-respected columnists, but well-funded and sold columnists have explicitly called for the United States to intervene, to topple Lopez Obrador, to save Mexico from the dictator, using similar terminology to Guaido, for instance. We've had visits from Guaido's henchmen, of course, and but there's a similar kind of strategy there. There's this international network that our colleague in Spain, he does analysis of networks. He's been putting out some very interesting reports.
Julian Macias.
Exactly. Julian Macias has been detecting the presence of this Atlas network with very, very well funded in Mexico, and he's been identifying different key journalists, opposition politicians, NGO leaders who are increasingly aggressive and articulated within the Mexican media sphere. And they have been very much betting on support from the United States and have been hoping for and provoking conflict between Trump and Lopez Obrador. Read, back to the first months after the Lopez Obrador election. Read articles, for instance, by Shannon O'Neill, who's the Mexican head at the Council for Foreign Relations. These kinds of think tanks. She was almost begging. She was like, "Oh, it looks like Lopez Obrador and Trump are going to get into a fight. Any one of these days. They're just, this is the relationship with Mexico and the United States is going to explode." And they wanted this to happen. perhaps because they're anti-Trump in some ways. They're liberal imperialists, liberal hawks, but particularly because they're against López Obrador. And any ally in this project to end what they consider populism in Latin America, or Mexico in particular, is of course on their agenda. And so López Obrador has been very smart. He's been very savvy without succumbing to Trump's demands. What he has done is not fallen into the provocations, but the Twitter battles, nor has he so he's been very practical, we could say, right?
Diplomatic.
Mexico, diplomatic and practical. Mexico is quite vulnerable, of course. United States is our number one commercial partner. 80% of our foreign trade goes to the United States. And the interesting thing here is that the United States is also, less so, of course, but is also very vulnerable to and dependent on the United States. This is the ironic thing, right? So the left, we were very much against NAFTA, both sides of the border, Mexico and the United States, since the 90s. But when López Obrador comes into the government, he realizes that the only thing perhaps worse than NAFTA is to end NAFTA from one day to the next, because you just simply end NAFTA, what you create is economic collapse. And the most intelligent strategy would be to use NAFTA to get to a different step. Now, is USMCA better than NAFTA or not? It does have a much more solid labor part of it in terms of this, for instance, union democracy and labor rights. López Obrador is very proud that in the negotiation of the new accord, he protected Mexican oil sovereignty, for instance. Trump wanted to create a North American oil market, free market, and Mexico refused to do so. And so, there's still some dangerous parts of it, for instance, on intellectual property and international litigation and the protection of transnational corporations against local, what used to be Chapter 11 of NAFTA, for instance. I mean, there's plenty of things that need to be changed, but it was better in the end to keep the economic relationship, to build through it instead of against it. And that was the meeting this last week, this Wednesday on June 8th. It was about. I wrote about this. Surprisingly, the Washington Post published me. I was very surprised. I don't know how that happened, but we were talking about what the article is about. The symbolism is incredible in terms of the ability and the unity between the people of Mexico and the United States, even though we have these two presidents who are so ideologically different, right? It's an incredible testament to the fact that Mexico and the United States are, for better or for worse, so profoundly united. Not even Trump could destroy this relationship, and López Obrador realized that and has played through it, and in the process has marked an incredible victory domestically in Mexico. So people talk about how Trump is trying to use this visit to appeal to the Mexican voters, etc. But the domestic political impact of the López Obrador visit to Trump in Mexico is spectacular. It's incredible. You should see all these guys who have been calling for the coup against López Obrador, who've been beating over him, trying to get him out of office. Some of them continue to be so, but many of them are just sort of in shock, right? I mean, they don't know what to do. They've realized that who was going to be their major support for kicking out López Obrador, Trump, is now somehow López Obrador's friends. They don't understand what's going on. They've just been completely run around in terms of this, the geopolitical strategic importance of this. And López Obrador is now about the migrants. We could talk about migrants. It's a difficult situation. There has been serious pressure, of course, from the United States. I would not say it's more pressure from Trump than from Obama, for instance. Obama was the border chief, right? 2 million Mexicans were
Nearly 3
expelled from the United
million,
States.
2.7 million.
Mexicans, or just
Oh,
in general?
well, no, in general, yeah.
Yeah,
I'm not sure
and
what
again,
number of
that three
Mexicans, but
million, but Mexicans, almost 2 million Mexicans were kicked out of the
wow.
United States under Obama. I don't know what the numbers are on Trump. Probably similar, perhaps less because of economic crisis and reasons. Um, I wouldn't say it's more pressure, perhaps more vocal, right, racist, of course, by Trump. But the actual diplomatic pressure has not been more under Trump than under Obama, and the response from Mexico has been much less subservient than it was under the previous government. What López Obrador has said is that what he wants to do is assure that there's in the end a common interest between the United States and Mexico in terms of migrants having the right to stay where they are, right? A right to remain in their communities, remain and have economic development opportunities there. And what he wants to do is convince the United States to invest in the southern part of Mexico and Central America so that people can stay where they are, and that would be in the interest of both Mexico and the United States. Meanwhile, what has the Mexican government done? What they have done is particularly crack down on organized crime, on human trafficking, because many of these caravans are spontaneous, but many of them also have an important element of international human trafficking, and so there Mexico has cracked down on that. That has led to a reduction in the flow of Central Americans and of Mexicans towards the northern border. There have been some shows of sort of dramatic shows of force of the Mexican military, the police helping to stop migrants from crossing the United States. Those are very unfortunate images, not images that no one is proud of. But what I can say is that this is not a constant policy by any means, or by any means at all. This is sort of more media gestures to keep Trump happy, right? And so the real challenge is that developing the south of Mexico. Mexico has committed $20 million, if I remember the number right, of support itself towards development in Central America. So they're doing their own part of development towards the south, and in general, another area of serious defensive sovereignty, in addition to the oil issue, is the question of national security and of policing. So beforehand, under Calderon and under Peña Nieto, the previous two presidents, really the anti-cartel strategies in Mexico were dictated from Washington. There are even cases in which one of the captures of the Chapo Guzman was made by U.S. agents dressed as Mexican military agents, who were the ones who captured Chapo Guzman.
They were following Sean Penn to the location, or
exactly. It was the previous capture right before that one, right? But they wanted to do it with Sean Penn too. But yeah, so they used to be and that would just create total chaos, because they were the capo who would be targeted and captured would not be the decision on that case, and when and where was not being taken with regard to national security or peace concerns, but based on decisions in Washington. And that has changed radically. That now it's Mexico who's in charge of its own national security and law enforcement action. So, but please ask, question me.
I mean, thank you so much for covering all of that. There's so much we could go into, but I want to transition a little bit and talk about Mexico's international position, not just vis-a-vis the U.S., but the rest of Latin America, because I think this is another point that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. I mean, there has been some discussion in the left. I've been actually living in Nicaragua, and there is definitely a much more positive opinion of the role of Mexico, especially in Venezuela. People are very grateful to Mexico, to the role that it's played, not necessarily as some kind of, this is the point I always make to people. It's not like Andrés Manuel is like some anti-imperialist. He's not Fidel Castro, but he has played a very important role just inserting moderation and diplomacy into what had previously been really a subordinated position to Washington. And I think a lot of the issues that you're talking about, John, the issue of migration, border issues, relations with Trump, a lot of that's baked into the political system. Those are inherent factors and contradictions because Mexico shares a 2,000-mile border with the U.S. And, the U.S. since the 1830s has declared Latin America its own imperial backyard with the Monroe Doctrine, and we've seen the Trump administration, multiple figures invoke the Monroe Doctrine, including Mike Pompeo and John Bolton. But what's interesting is to see that, we talked about some of the weaknesses of the new renegotiated NAFTA 2.0, migration. I've been very impressed to see that AMLO has actually taken even more brave positions on international issues. We saw him give a speech a few weeks ago in June, in which López Obrador said that he would consider selling gasoline to Venezuela. And then journalists asked, well, wouldn't you be afraid of the consequences? Of course, implying that the U.S. would hit Mexico with sanctions. And he said, we're a sovereign country. We can have relations with anyone we want. We also saw that a few days later after that speech, the U.S. did impose sanctions on Mexico, and that did, for a brief turn, it hurt the Mexican peso. So that's a tangible example there of him taking a position that actually that he felt consequences for, but he didn't back down from. And then, there's other examples. I want you to talk in a second, but I'll just mention that what's interesting is also seeing Mexico's role in the OAS, because we've seen the Organization of American States just completely bomb just explode its own reputation. Luis Almagro is now the Secretary General, is openly calling for the U.S. military to invade Venezuela. He's trying to orchestrate a coup here in Nicaragua. He's calling for the violent overthrow of the Cuban government. He's totally taken the mask off. But at the same time, we've seen Mexico, which traditionally had much more of a backseat role. We've seen that Mexican diplomats have been taking the lead, pushing for a much more careful, measured kind of multilateralism. So what do you, I've kind of already answered part of it, but that's my take from looking at it, from Nicaragua and from being in Venezuela last year. What is the view of Mexico's role internationally or in the region now?
No, it's everything you say is absolutely correct. It's very funny because López Obrador was accused of being, anti-internationalist, right? Because he himself has said, the best foreign policy is a good domestic policy, leading by example. And up till this week, he hadn't left the country as president. This was his first visit out of the country to Washington to visit Trump. But people have visited him. Then the president of Spain came, president of El Salvador.
Díaz-Canel de Cuba.
Díaz-Canel, of course, the president-elect of Argentina, his first trip and his only trip before taking power in Argentina was to Mexico City. We hosted him at the UNAM with a very nice conferencia magistral. And his policy towards Latin America has been totally 180-degree change. But interestingly enough, recuperating the historic tradition of sovereign foreign policy and of independence in Latin America. This is not something new, right? This goes back to the Mexican Revolution. When the Mexican Revolution occurred, Mexico was very zealous of defending its own independence from the United States, from United States adventurism in the rest of Latin America. And they developed this policy of no intervention precisely in order to protect the sovereignty and democracy and shift towards the left that was happening throughout Latin America. And so,
and if I can just interject, what an episode that has often been kind of erased from history textbooks and modern understanding is that throughout the Cold War, during the time of Plan Condor, of Operation Condor, when the U.S. is supporting all of these murderous right-wing dictatorships in Latin America. Mexico City specifically was the kind of main hub for left-wing leaders across the region and provided refuge to them. I mean, it was also the biggest CIA site, so there was a lot of stuff happening and a kind of internal battle.
Yep, Mexico City, I mean, is known as, the Paris of Latin America, although, all these European metaphors are have to be in question. But, Paris played that role also in the 19th century, 20th century. Marx himself hid out in Paris for a while. He's always the center for the political emigres from throughout Europe, and that was the role of Mexico and the UNAM in particular. I'm very proud to work at the National Autonomous University, right, from Argentina, from Bolivia, from Uruguay, from Chile. During the 70s and the 80s, Mexico has always been a center for refugees, and that's when Evo came. That was part of that tradition. Bringing Evo Morales to Mexico was a continuation of that long tradition of independence in political and international affairs, and of the right to asylum, particularly when there are right-wing coups in Latin America. And so López Obrador has very, calmly but firmly redefined and recuperated that tradition. He immediately left Mexico, took Mexico out of the Lima Coalition, right? The Lima Coalition was that coalition which was basically led by Mexico, although it was called the Lima Coalition. It was really led by Peña Nieto and Videgaray as the foreign minister, doing the dirty work for the United States in Venezuela. And for Mexico to withdraw from that coalition, they tried to create a new one in Uruguay, which didn't quite take off. But now Mexico is head of the CELAC, which is the Latin American Community of States, which is sort of the alternative to the OAS. And yes, Mexico's role in Venezuela saved lives. It's subtle diplomatic role, but it was a very, and it continues to be a very important role in terms of stubbornly insisting on democratic institutional channels for overcoming conflict. Is very important, very essential. Its position on Bolivia has been very, very important, and in general, in Latin America, has been a stabilizing force, and it has supported. In Ecuador, we have sort of a shadow government almost of the whole Correa administration is here in Mexico City. His ex-secretary of education, his foreign minister, his military minister, the secretary of culture, different deputies from the National Assembly. We have a whole diaspora of left-wing Correaista politicians here in Mexico City, which is continuing that same old tradition as well. And so that's been very important. So López Obrador is not Lula in terms of getting out there and being the leader of the South in the sort of more public positioning, but in his practical behavior, he has become a very important force for Latin American sovereignty, and that's what gives him the strength and the force to be able to go and shake hands with Trump and give a marvelous speech. By the way, it was a very important historical speech, talking about the union between the United States and Mexico as countries, and the need to go beyond particular conflicts. In one of the articles I wrote in the Mexican media, I compared it, very different, but I compared the classic case of Nixon going to China, right? I mean, no one really questioned Nixon for his patriotic commitment when he went to China, right? In the same way, López Obrador, in the end, he's the only one who could possibly go and meet with Trump without losing face. And to the contrary, not only did not lose face, but he positions himself as a global leader, at least to the Mexican side, much more important than Trump himself. And so this has been a really important achievement for him, and it gives him lots of strength for continuing on with the fourth transformation.
And can you also briefly talk about the Grupo Puebla? Because this is a kind of new international or regional alliance of left-wing parties in Latin America, and Mexico has played an important role in the Grupo Puebla.
The Grupo Puebla is an idea still. It's had a few meetings. It had a meeting in Puebla, which started last summer, about a year ago. It hasn't actually become an alliance of left-wing parties yet, or governments yet. What it is right now is a series of meetings of leading figures, particularly people who are not in government. So Lula and Dilma and Mujica are the ones who are really leading that, and Mexico is very much supporting it. But we need to take the next step. The really important institutional sort of alternative, network alternative, is the CELAC, the Comunidad Latinoamericana, where Mexico is the president of that for this year. We'll see what happens next year because it has to be voted, and most of the countries in Latin America are still on the right, so probably the next year it'll go back to Peru or Colombia or something like that. But yeah, the Grupo Puebla is an important initiative, but we need to go beyond it. We need to really sort of institutionalize. Argentina is a real good ally. Mexico and Argentina together can do a lot. It's a real shame that Brazil is in such terrible shape. We'll see what happens in Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador. I mean, we're still very much in the minority, the left-wing governments in Latin America.
What about the opposition to AMLO? You sort of dismissed it as weak and in disarray, a little bit shocked by his success and political creativity. But Ben and a writer named Jose Guadalupe Arguello did an important piece for us on the far-right oligarchs working to topple AMLO, and specifically the Frena group, which is sort of like a front of anti-AMLO organizations that's proposing the kind of color revolution that we saw, with these gene sharp tactics take form in Venezuela through the Guarimbas, or in Nicaragua in 2018 through the Tranques, and comes out of the Eastern Europe CIA, State Department playbook. They're basically driving around doing these car caravans every week, and it's not clear to me how much impact they're making. But I mean, how much of a threat is this? And is this really the true face of? I mean, this guy Gilberto Lozano, who has all these contracts with multinational corporations, is the face of it, and he seems like he's like a Bolsonaro level whack job. From the outside, it seems kind of crazy, and you can dismiss it. But Bolsonaro went from being a backbencher to president. So, is it really something that
Trump, right?
and Trump, yeah. Trump at least had a reality show. I mean, he was known.
Right. Yes. No, I saw that article. That great stuff, guys. I mean, it's really important for this to get out to be vented in international media and discussed. I think your article was sent to me by probably about 20 different people from different, by WhatsApp and email. Everybody was
Amazing.
excited about it. Like, John, you got to see this.
Well, that's what we do it for.
Exactly. No, very good job. Thank you very much for not for me, but for the country. That we need international attention. I thank you guys for this opportunity to talk as well. Yes, well, I mean, we got different ways of looking at it. Objectively, right at this moment, the opposition is totally disarrayed. Their only force is the private media oligopolies, right? I mean, there are three major private television stations. There are 5 radio networks. Each one of them, the television station has 4 channels of them. 2 of them, one of them has 5, the other one has 2 channels. The radio stations are controlled by 5 or 6 different families. Newspapers, the majority of them are also, that's where they have their strength.
Yeah.
In terms of the opposition in Mexico is the press. Not the press. Sorry, they're going to take that out of context. It's the right wing press. A sector of the press is the
corporate media.
The corporate media. There you go. That's the term. The corporate media. Because there's plenty of great journalists as well. But that's the real opposition. The political opposition, the party opposition, is totally destroyed. This is the situation. There used to be 3 major parties: the PRI, the PRD, and the PAN, right? The PRD was the center-left party. The PRI was the old guard authoritarian party, and the PAN was the social democrat, Christian Democrat, right-wing party. All three of those parties are on the verge of extinction. I mean, the PRD is probably going to lose its national accreditation at the next election next year, the midterm election. The PAN, Calderon, their ex-president, is resigned from the PAN a year and a half ago and is trying to create his own party. And the PAN has probably a base support of 8% maybe. And the PRI, which is the old guard party, which was in power for 70, 80 years, it went out of power in the presidency for 12 years and came back with Peña Nieto, without control of the federal budget or even a lot of state budgets, is probably also on its way out. And so Morena, which is the new party which supports López Obrador, won with 30 million votes, 53%, 2-1 over the second place in 2000, and is basically faced with no real political opposition. Calderon's trying to create his new party. There are other little parties which are trying to be created, but there's no alternative project. There's not even a clear idea of a right-wing project. All they want to do is go back to what they had before. There's no vision at all, right? And so that creates a situation for the media to sort of fill that political void. And on the other hand, it creates a space for these crazies, right? So Gilberto Lozano, Frena, is not a substantive movement. And there are not a lot of people who come out at their protests, maybe a few hundred cars when they do it every month, sometimes do it more frequently. It's not a mass movement.
Well, if I can jump in, that's part of the strategy, is that because they have so few people who support them, because everyone knows that they're an extremely elite right-wing group that only represents rich people, they use these car protests in order to portray themselves as larger. And I just wanted to add that we now know that Lozano and Frena, his group, were inspired to do these protests by Vox. And Vox is the neo-Francoist, basically a neo-fascist party in Spain, which their leader, Abascal, has explicitly quoted Francisco Franco, the fascist Spanish dictator, as his influence. And so Lozano is looking to figures like that to model his movement against AMLO after.
Of course. And the COVID context doesn't help because, when you have a normal context, people driving around in their cars, it seems weird, right? All these elitists in their cars. But in COVID, we're all kind of have to be behind four walls, protected, and so it's almost normal for people to it seems almost normal for them to be protesting in their cars. In general, my fear is that the COVID quarantine stuff is in general favorable to these groups because on the social networks, for instance, it's much easier to make a small amount of people appear as if they're a large, a big current of opinion, and the left is its strength has always been lots of people out onto the streets. Protesting or supporting or being together in solidarity, and we don't have that possibility. Well, you guys in the United States don't seem to care too much about that. You guys are giving us the example of that protests are possible in the COVID context. But so, for instance, Twitter in Mexico at least has become totally toxic. It's an incredible. It used to be, and I still love Twitter. It's my home. Is where I love to explore, to inform myself, to debate, to get my stuff out. But they put so much money into Twitter that it's just totally toxic now. And there's and these same networks, the guys that Julian Macias has investigated, are all it's the equivalent of the car protests or the Twitter bots or the Twitter accounts. And so they're doing their best job, and they know that they're a minor force right now. They're marginal, but that doesn't matter now. What they're trying to do is create, a context of opposition so that when the moment is right, when there's a real political crisis, they can really jump, right? And so they try to jump on any possible political crisis. I remember, one of the last year, the governor of Puebla his helicopter fell down and he died. Sorry, she was the governor of Puebla, and her husband is a senator. They were in a helicopter and it crashed a year ago. And immediately people started to blame this on López Obrador and try to create a political crisis out of an accident. And any narco killing is created as a supposed political crisis for López Obrador. And so they do it consistently, one after a time, and they're trying to create a context for rebellion. But it's not as easy in Mexico as it is in other places. Or at least I'd like to think this is the case. You'll have to interview me in a few years to see whether I'm right. But there is something about Mexican political culture which is particularly resistant to this kind of right-wing crazy stuff. It is true that in the 2018 election, the candidate of this group, Jaime Rodríguez Calderón, the governor of Nuevo León, got 5% nationally, but among youth in the north of Mexico, he got 20%. So that's an alarm bell coming on there. But in general,
and for context, for people who don't know, that the north is the richer region, which is normally associated with the kind of right-wing oligarchy and the Grupo Monterrey and things like that.
Exactly, Monterrey is in the north. That's the sort of the center of the industrial financial center is Monterrey, right? But in general, because of the Mexican Revolution, because of the way in which politics is thought about and organized in Mexico, there's some antibodies. I'd like to think, what's considered to be progressive in the United States is more, centrist in Mexico. Everything is basically sort of shifted towards the left, right? Even our right-wing intellectuals like Enrique Krause, who continues to publish his stuff in New York Review-Books and the New York Times, sort of masquerades as a liberal in the United States. I can't understand. I can't believe that people in the United States are so blinded to believe this. In Mexico is our major right-wing intellectual, and here he's considered to be talking to you guys.
Our liberals would be right-wing intellectuals in most other countries.
Well, George Bush is now the anti-Trump resistance.
Right, exactly. So the Mexican political culture is sort of shifted towards the left. That's why López Obrador won by so much, and that's why he has so much support, even though he's being bashed by the media every day. And that's why it's so good to get an alternative vision out on international media with you guys.
Well, I don't want to keep you too much longer, John, so we'll start wrapping up soon. But another thing that I wanted to ask you about was another opposition group that appears to be organizing to try to remove AMLO, and López Obrador himself. He gives these daily press briefings, and at one several weeks ago in June, he released this bombshell report, and it's a leaked executive summary from a group that calls itself the Bloque Opositor Amplio, the Broad Opposition Bloc, or BOA. And that led to a massive social media storm. The right wing claiming that this is a fake document and that it was all a media stunt, etc. So, but what's interesting about this document is, again, it's just the executive summary, so it doesn't go into great detail about the strategy, but it names some of these figures we've talked about. Calderón. It names Frena as a member, this far right group. It also names the media outlets that are sympathetic to the opposition and may even be part of this opposition bloc, and it names basically every major media outlet in Mexico. So what is your take on BOA and the right-wingers who are saying that this is all fake and it's an AMLO creation?
Well, this BOA document is basically transparent description of what's happening. It's not any kind of secret document. Apparently, it was leaked to the López Obrador team, and people have questioned its validity or not. But the important thing is not where it came from exactly, who gave it to whom, but when you actually read the document, it's what's happening. I mean, there's a very clear strategy. The funny thing is that it's more of the fantasy of the opposition, that document, than the reality, because it's what they should be doing, is organizing these different media groups, Calderon, Fox, ex-president, Frena, Gilberto Lozano, if in their best interest would be to, organize themselves as a big opposition bloc against López Obrador. But in fact, they have so many interests and fights between them and bad blood between them throughout the neoliberal history that they're not even capable of doing that. They're so divided between themselves that the BOA, which is a good idea for them, is actually probably not going to happen. I mean, the central issue, the central proposal in that document is for the midterm elections next year, 2021. Our presidential terms are 6 years, and so the legislative terms are 3 years. And 2021 is the midterm legislative elections, only for the Chamber of Deputies, but for all the Chamber of Deputies. The central proposal for the BOA document is that everybody should get together and in each district, for instance, support a single candidate against the Morena candidate. That would be a good idea for them, but it's almost impossible for one to imagine that this actually happening. I mean, Calderon himself is creating a new party, fighting against his old party, the PAN, so not even at that level are they getting along. And imagine the PRI getting on there, and the three different national television networks are all against López Obrador, but they're also against each other, fighting for, the market share which is left. Because one of the things that López Obrador has done, and it's one of the reasons why they're so angry, is he's cut by 2/3 the amount of government spending on advertising on television and radio. And when you combine that with the rise of social networks and the reduction of advertising money from the private sector, these huge, television companies, which used to sort of rule the world, are now in major crisis. And so they're fighting against it between themselves for the crumbs. And so the world is collapsing on the BOA. They should really, make a BOA, but I don't think it's going to happen. And so in the end, I'm pretty optimistic. I mean, López Obrador, his major possible problem was the United States and Trump. He's neutralized that. COVID and economic crisis are a major problem in the world in general. We'll see how Mexico comes out of this. Where the predictions say that Mexico will, lose 9%, 8% of its GDP this year. But in the end, and this is what López Obrador says, the really important thing is not the GDP, but it's the well-being of the Mexican people. And if the Mexican government can continue to support social programs and help the poorest parts of the Mexican population, then the likelihood of recovery and a recovery from bottom up instead of top down could actually lead to this rebirth could be a new economy, a more popular grassroots-based economy, which could be the silver lining on this COVID crisis and economic crisis.
Well, I know it's getting late for you, John, so we'll let you go pretty soon. My final question, I just thought it would be remiss if I didn't ask you, John, because you've been involved in several scandals. I mean, not you. You don't deserve.
That's a bad way.
You don't deserve the scandals. That's let me rephrase that. You've been involved. You've been the target of many attacks, and specifically recently, there has been a major scandal in the media. Oh, major's the wrong word. I mean, a ridiculous attack that was blown out of proportion. But what's interesting about this is that in this most recent attack, you criticized the media for fueling violence, and that has led to groups like the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is funded by some of these large corporations, the largest media conglomerates on earth. In fact, the CPJ has also attacked us, attacked Max Blumenthal here. They have also, they work directly.
Well, they haven't explicitly attacked us, but they've definitely, participated in campaigns against us, and they're actually funding opposition media in Nicaragua. So it's clear where their agenda lies. But Ben, you were
and they work closely with the kind of most vicious right-wing golpistas in Nicaragua, including they gave an award to Miguel Mora, who's the head of this right-wing media. I mean, it's not even a news website; it's just a right-wing propaganda website. And he openly called for the U.S. military to invade Nicaragua to remove President Ortega. So anyway, the fact that CPJ is attacking you is in some ways, honestly, it's a good sign. It's a sign you're doing something right. But I just wanted to ask you about it because what we saw, it's so wild, is that many people have been saying for the past year and more that Calderón, the former right-wing president, has been helping to lead the campaign against AMLO and against you and other prominent supporters. And he just made that entirely clear by going on Twitter. And Calderón has been openly, publicly calling for you to be fired and has been leading the campaign against you.
Exactly. Calderón, last couple of days, he's probably busy with other stuff, but during about 2 weeks or more, daily, he would send me about 5 or 6 Twitter mentions and send massive amounts of bots and attacks on me. And so they've gone progressively. So first, a journalist, I guess you could call him, did a report on our house, right, in which basically, with my wife who works combating corruption in the government, put our house on the television, basically kind of threatening us, inviting people to attack us and accusing us of having acquired this house illegally based on totally trumped up fake charges. We responded by saying that we were going to bring a civil suit against this journalist who's actually based in the United States. He's based in Delaware, in order to avoid Mexican libel laws and U.S. tax laws.
Yeah, John, you're talking about Carlos Loretta de Mola, right?
Exactly.
And
exactly. It's Carlos de Mola.
Yeah, and Loretta de Mola, actually, in the piece that we published at the Gray Zone, we showed how Loretta de Mola works very closely with a corporate lobbying group called ASCOA, the America Society Council of the Americas, which was founded by the Rockefellers and is funded by all of the major corporations in the U.S. It's a lobby group for U.S. corporations in Latin America. And this journalist, this so-called journalist who libeled you, he works with this lobby group.
Right. Yeah, it was a political attack. So, and right after that program, his next program, he interviewed Calderón for an hour. And so it was obvious that the attack was coming from Calderón. And then the second step was, yes, on Twitter, I put a message, basically, saying that there are people. I didn't use the word journalists. I said there are people in the media who act as if they were, sharpshooters, who they, try to create violence, put into risk the lives of people, and try to destroy reputations. And that immediately created this reaction of CPJ and others. Then the next attack was the next week was they tried to create the impression that my PhD degree was somehow false by putting up a picture of it and then saying that it didn't have the right seals and stuff. It was a ridiculous thing, but they created this. I have 2 PhDs, actually. I have one PhD at the University of California in sociology and a second PhD in law from the UNAM. But this is sort of like, character assassination attack. And it's all about, in general, my role, but specifically because I'm a member of a ad hoc committee which is going to choose the future or participate in choosing the future electoral councilors. And Calderón is creating a new party. He wants to become, through that party, a member of the Chamber of Deputies, our Chamber of Deputies, the House of Representatives, and through that get legal immunity so he doesn't end up in jail next to his buddy El Chapo Guzman, who's in jail now in the United States. We've just extradited from Spain Emilio Lozoya, who is the head of the major head of the national oil corporation. Pemex is on his way to Mexico now. Just this last Wednesday, we've also extradited Cesar Duarte, who's an incredibly corrupt governor of the state of Chihuahua. And so, Calderon is afraid of justice being brought to him because he is mixed up in lots of corrupt and violent deals. And so he sees me as an enemy, and so he's organized this international network, as you guys are very clearly portraying, against me, and they've identified me as a very important piece to knock down in their struggle against López Obrador and populism in Mexico. But like I said, these are desperate attempts of very small groups who do not have mass support. We shouldn't underestimate them. It's very important to respond and to defend the fourth transformation, the transformation of Mexican society. And thank you guys very much. Hopefully we can talk again soon, and be in touch. Come visit us in Mexico City, please. Once the COVID controls let you get on airplane, like this, López Obrador just flew to the United States, so you guys should come fly down this way whenever you want.
I plan on it soon.
We don't want to bring any of the U.S. flu down there right now. U.S. virus. So I'm waiting for Bill Gates to cook up a vaccine in the military to come to my house and plunge a needle in my arm before I come down. But we can't thank you enough for joining us. And what you're describing, from the campaign against you to the overall campaign, and the nature of it, the cynical nature of it, really shows that it's not just a battle for the future of the left in Mexico or for social justice, and it's also a battle for the survival of the kind of democracy that's being constructed right now. So it's really important that we have you as our eyes and ears on the ground, bringing this to a English language audience. It was really a privilege.
To the contrary, Max, thank you very much. Thanks to you, Ben. A real privilege. Keep up the good work.
Thanks a lot. And if you want to support our work at Moderate Rebels, go to patreon.com/Moderate Rebels. And that's really how we keep this show going. We produce it ourselves, and we bring it to you without any paywalls or subscriptions. So thanks out there to everyone who's supporting us.
Cool.
And we're out.
And that's it. We'll see you next time.